When we get to lunch, we're going to be so far behind the scheduled point of departure, but that's fine. I mean, part of what we're doing here, of course, is to try to put in a fair bit of information. We certainly want time for conversation and discussion. That's really important. But we are trying to cover territory which, on a more traditional offering, we'd have a whole night just for critical approaches to the Old Testament, maybe 2 nights on critical approaches to the Old Testament. We only meet these 4 times, so we're trying to put in a range of content and experiences and so on. So anyway, we're now picking it up at looking at the world in front of the text, beyond the text, or the world of the reader, depending how you want to describe it. And the headline issue here is that we're focusing on the reader rather than the book, rather than the history behind the book. Okay, so the headline kind of issue here is reader response criticism, which is recognizing that it's actually the reader who creates meaning as she reads the text. Now, some of that creation of meaning is already pre-inscribed and pre-coded into the text, but the reader has to be able to make sense of it and, in a sense, perform it, even if it's just in our own head. And so there's been a shift of attention. I talk about the shift from the text to the reader. And this, of course, diminishes the contribution of historical critical studies, and quite validly so. At the end of the day, no matter how sophisticated and critical our study of Scripture is, it still has to work for the average person in the pew who picks up the Bible and reads it. And they will make some sense of it. And if it's the kind of sense which helps them to live more compassionate, healthy lives, that's good. If it's the kind of sense that turns them into bigots and racists who are afraid of people that are different, then I suggest that's a toxic reading of Scripture. And that's where the critical scholarship can help to improve the hermeneutical processes. So as readers, we take the text and we perform it, and we are not trying to reconstruct the past, but we are looking for wisdom for the present. We want to hear God tell us what to do, basically. Now, one metaphor I find helpful there is the metaphor of a musical score. The composer creates the musical score, but then each performer and each conductor, if it's a group performance, has to interpret and manage that performance. So the same work can sound very different depending on who's performing it. And I think to me, that speaks to the question of biblical interpretation. We perform the text. So what is a contemporary 21st century Australian Anglican performance of the biblical tradition? Okay. What are the continuities with the 19th century Anglican performance of the Bible? What are the differences from a 19th century or 18th century performance? So in the 18th century, it wouldn't have occurred to most Anglicans that slavery was not a good thing. In the 21st century, most of us probably think slavery is not a good thing and pretend our iPhones do not come from slave factories in China. Okay? Or our coffee doesn't come from slave labour in some other part of the world. So all of the critical methods we're going to touch on briefly in the next couple of minutes are to some extent examples of focusing on the reader. The priority now rests with the reader, even though the possibilities for the reader are to some extent preset by the construction of the text. Okay, so it's not that it's not a blank sheet, obviously, and it's not that any meaning is as good as any other meaning. Your reading's as good as my reading's no better than your reading. We have to have some criteria for saying that's a good way to read the Bible, an appropriate way to read the Bible, that's an inappropriate way to read the Bible, particularly in public discourse. Okay, when the Christian values or biblical values are deployed for political and social debate, is it being done in a wholesome, holistic kind of way? So feminist criticism of the Bible, for instance, will take seriously the experience of women. So men can do feminist criticism if men pay attention to the woman's experience in this passage, but men cannot do feminist hermeneutics as well as women, generally speaking. Okay, and in very raw, broad terms. So it's basically addressing and redressing the traditional male dominance of biblical scholarship, because most of the people who've done biblical scholarship for most of the 2,000 years, past 2,000 years, have been privileged males, usually ordained, and for the most part without wives and children. So they read the Bible through that experience and cannot do anything but read the Bible through that experience. Okay? So feminist criticism is of course growing out of the whole sensitivity to women's issues in the West over the last 40 or 50 years, or 40 years at least. And it's not so much a new method, because a feminist scholar will use textual criticism and form criticism, historical criticism, but they'll ask the questions that only a woman will think to ask. Like, how come there's no girls in this story? How come the characters that are male have names and the women either don't have names, or they're just so-and-so's daughter or so-and-so's wife or so-and-so's concubine, number 353, in the case of Solomon's batch. And of course, as I've just said, it exposes this lack of self-awareness amongst privileged male clergy scholars in the past and indeed the present. Okay, so feminist scholars contribute right across the whole breadth of biblical scholarship. They're not only concerned with feminist criticism. Critical to the feminist perspective is a tool called the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is to say, so what was really going on here? Why is the story being told this way? What's the underlying agenda? Don't just go with the surface level, but ask questions about, so what else is happening here? Be suspicious of the text, if you like, and also read against the grain of the text. Okay, and so if it's not there, still by using holy imagination and critically disciplined imagination. So if there are no women mentioned at the Last Supper, does that mean they were absent? What does that mean for us? Or let's imagine we're one of the women at the Last Supper, and we're not very happy that Mark left us out, or whatever. Okay. Third one is mentioning what are called post-colonial studies or liberationist criticism, and this is partly the effect of the 19th, 20th century European Christian colonialism, spreading through the world and then retreating eventually, and leaving behind a legacy of colonial churches who then had to find their own identity. For instance, Indian Christians had to find their own identity in a post-British India. African theologians finding their identity as Christians who are authentically Anglican rather than just shadows of the British Empire or the French Empire or whatever. So what's been their experience, and how do they connect reading the Bible with the dynamics of how Christianity has been experienced in a colonial context moving into a post-colonial context? Liberation theology is similar, but its roots are more in South America, where it's not so much a post-colonial situation as what is the significance of the gospel, what's the significance of the Bible for the oppressed majority? How can these texts be texts of liberation and hope for people who might otherwise look to Marxism or whatever? And indeed, what is the interface of Marxism and Scripture and faith? So liberation theology is about finding a way to use the Bible as tools of resistance and tools of liberation. And what a colleague, Nancy Pereira, who I was speaking at a conference with her a couple of months ago, she referred to the North Atlantic Theological Organization, which I thought was pretty cute. Who controls the agenda for biblical scholarship? Germans, French, British, North Americans. NATO, the North American Theological Organization. Where's the voice of the South in the theological agenda? Okay.
Baptist Theological Seminary.
No, they are thoroughly embedded in the North American theological scene. They're not interested in the poor. They're not interested in liberation. They're interested in church growth and scalps, notches on the Bible, that sort of thing. So so this is a totally different agenda from the Northern European agenda. This is how does Christianity look and feel in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Palestine, and so on. And it's the future of Christianity, because most Christians are now in those places. They're not in Northern Europe, and they won't be in North America, I suspect, for much longer. So one example of this would be Palestinian liberation theology, which is taking up the question, how does a Palestinian Christian read the Old Testament? How do they find hope and identity and meaning as Palestinians under Israeli occupation, when the Israeli Jews are waving the Old Testament saying God gave us this land? Okay, so how do they read the Bible in that context as Christians in Palestine? Okay, that's a liberationist perspective on the Old Testament. Yeah.
How does the contextual theology fit into that? Does that emerge out of this kind of criticism?
Well, contextual theology is this whole world in front of the text stuff. So, and simply feminist hermeneutics is contextual theology, paying attention to the context and experience of women. So post-colonial liberation theology are examples of contextual theology. I think they're primarily, whether we talk about context or perspective, we're really focusing on the reader. Yeah, either the context of the reader, circumstances of the reader, or the perspective of the reader, which will be linked to their context. Yeah. Then there's eco-theological criticism, the reading from the perspective of Earth. And it's deliberately asking questions about, so how is Earth and her creatures represented in this? And indeed, how do we even think of Earth? Is Earth something else, or are we part of Earth? Okay. Do we have an anthropocentric view of reality, or do we have an Earth-centered, geocentric view of reality? And if you change your frame of reference, then what does sin mean in a geocentered world? Okay? What does sin mean for the ancient Jewish people in a temple-centered world? Well, sin was offending the purity codes of the temple. Okay? It wasn't having sexual thoughts before you went to sleep at night. That's a very moralistic European post-Reformation kind of set of hang-ups. So depending what our frame of reference is, our definition of sin and salvation and Christ is going to change. Now, of course, that's nothing to do with Old Testament studies, and yet it is, because Christians read the Old Testament. Okay, and it's part of our Bible. So how is the earth blessed or cursed in these stories? How is the earth nurtured and explored? So, think about the flood story. Okay, traditionally, we think about the impact on the humans. But it's the earth that's being punished. It's the earth that's being destroyed. Not just the human population on the earth. And it's all the animals who didn't get onto the ark who are being punished. Okay? Now, we don't have to think that that's a story of something that actually happened, but it's a story that encapsulates and embeds certain values. And do we ever spare a thought? Like, because of all the women in my family, as in sisters and daughters, they're all horse people. There's some defect in my genetic inheritance that gives this gene to all the women in my family. But you read this story in Exodus 15, and Yahweh, the Lord God, slew the Egyptians and all their chariots and all the horses of Pharaoh's army. Really? What about the horses? You don't have to be the president of Grinda Pony Club to think there's something wrong with that story. Okay? Now that's a question from my context. It's not a question from the context of the ancient Middle East. Okay? And it's saying, actually, God cares about the horses. Okay? God cares about the mountains. God cares about the trees. They're not just props for the human story. They're part of God's creation. So it's It's repositioning humanity within the ecosystem and picking up the theological implications of that. So we think about God differently when we recognise that God actually cares for the whole of the physical world and not just for Homo sapiens. Okay? And to me that's really exciting stuff. It has huge implications for the mission of the church, for the mission of church schools. You know, why are we doing education? Because God cares about education. God doesn't just want souls, He wants whole beings. So eco-theological criticism is replacing an anthropocentric set of readings and therefore an anthropocentric religion with a geocentric set of readings, a geocentric religion. Christianity will change if we take this seriously. Okay? So you're right to be worried. Then there's confessional criticism, okay, which is in a sense a more familiar way of reading the Bible. This is, now we can see there's one of several ways of reading the Bible, but confessional criticism is saying, let's read the Bible from the perspective of my religious community. I want to read the Bible as an evangelical. I want to read the Bible as a Catholic. I want to read the Bible as a liberal Anglican. I want to read the Bible, you know, as a Baptist or whatever. So these are recognising that we use the Bible differently because the community to which we already have an affiliation affects the way we receive the Bible. Even indeed what's in my Bible will depend upon which group I belong to. Okay? It also gives us scope to pay attention to ecumenical and interfaith readings. And one of the groups I most enjoy being a part of is a group called the Biblical Characters in the Three Traditions Seminar of the Society of Biblical Literature. And these are Jewish, Christian and Muslim scholars who look at characters in the Bible and say, now, what's an Islamic perspective on this? What's a Christian perspective? And it's not the Christian perspective. What's a Jewish perspective? Now, I find that an amazingly rich way of engaging with Scripture. Okay? And it's not about persuading my Jewish and Muslim colleagues that they should read it my way, but it's about finding new ways of reading the Scripture as we listen to each other. So how does my community read these texts? Are traditional readings sacrosanct, or are they open to change? Now I'm meddling in systematic theology again. But it has happened. Will my church change its beliefs and practices in light of new readings of the Bible? Or is the Bible only allowed to say things that we already believe? Okay? In other words, we've locked it down in the creeds and the 39 articles, the conversation is over. Okay? Now it has happened. The church has changed the way it does business in the light of new readings and new theological understandings. Okay? And that's where we should have got before the break. So let me just kill that one for a moment and go into the first of the Torah ones, which will be this one here. It's pretty pictures. Okay, so changing gear. With all that as background, we're going to start a journey through the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And as we do that, I'm going to deliberately use those criteria we've just been exploring. We're going to look at these 5 books, from the world behind the text, the world within the text, and the world of the reader. Okay? So I'm going to take that methodology we've just been outlining and apply it to the Pentateuch, and the first chunk before lunch will be focused on Genesis, and the material after lunch to afternoon tea will be focused on Exodus through Deuteronomy. So let's start then with the world behind the text, which means we're going to be looking at things like manuscripts, textual tradition, genre, source, redaction, historical, social science type material. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit already, so we won't need to go into it in great depth. But the key question, of course, is what evidence do we have to establish beyond any reasonable doubt the wording of these documents? given the importance of the Bible as text, we want to know we've got the right text, the correct text. Okay, and so one if you like, easy example of that is for several hundred years, the King James Bible was it. These days we have lots of alternative translations, and they differ from the King James. Why is that so? Well, the basic reason is because the King James translation was based on a version of the Hebrew and Greek text called the Textus Receptus. This was the received text of the Hebrew and Greek available to Northern Europeans in the post-Reformation period. And it was actually a very faulty Hebrew and Greek manuscript. Okay? We now have access to much more accurate manuscripts, or we have older manuscripts. We're able to produce a much more accurate critical edition. Therefore, some passages, some phrases, some paragraphs which were in the King James Bible have disappeared because we recognise they were never meant to be there. Okay, so that's the kind of issue we're sometimes dealing with. So it's how clear, certain, confident can we be about the validity of the textual tradition. Now, we've already mentioned this about the Codex Leningrad and the Aleppo Codex, so we won't reissue those. In the case of the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, the only point from that previous one is that we do have the whole of the Pentateuch in Leningrad, but we do not have the whole of the Pentateuch in Aleppo because of damage. Okay, but we do have other manuscripts, which I'll now point out. Is everybody up to speed with Torah and Pentateuch as alternative labels for Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy? Torah is the Jewish name meaning law, Torah. Pentateuch is the Greek word meaning 5 scrolls. Okay? So they're just slightly different ways of naming the phenomena of these 5 books. At Qumran, we have 24 manuscripts for Genesis, mostly just fragmentary, and 2 of those manuscripts include Genesis through to Exodus. So that allows us to jump 1,000 years from Leningrad back to about 150 BCE. Okay, so that's a brilliant insight. It's only been possible since the middle of the 20th century. Okay, so who knows what else will be discovered next week in June at Bethsaida, wherever. Okay, buy your tickets now. Then there's the Samaritan Pentateuch, which we don't pay a lot of attention to, don't hear about much. The Samaritans are descendants of the ancient people of Israel, and their Bible only consists of the Pentateuch. The rest is commentary. The rest is added by the Jerusalem crowd. All right, so whatever the actual history going on here, the Samaritan community within modern Israel, who of course speak Arabic, but they're Samaritans, their version of the Bible reflects a stage in history when the only Bible that existed was the Pentateuch. And they do not accept the prophets, and they do not accept the writings. Okay? So it gets a bit more complicated. Now, as it happens, the oldest manuscript for the Samaritan Pentateuch only dates to the 12th century, so it's about 100 years younger than the Leningrad Codex. Okay? That's still 800 or so years old. And it preserves a pre-Masoretic text, so MT is Masoretic text, the version of the Hebrew manuscripts from about the 6th, 7th century onwards. And this preserves a version of the text from the pre-Masoretic period. So although it's a 12th century document, it's copying and preserving like a 3rd or 4th century version of the manuscript. This gets into technical forms. And in many ways, the Samaritan Pentateuch manuscript is very similar to what we actually find in Qumran, which reinforces that idea that although the actual document is relatively late, the version that's preserved in that document is actually very ancient. Okay? And then we have the ancient versions, of which the Septuagint, LXX, the Greek translation, Greek version, is of course the most significant. We also have Aramaic, with the I, Targums. We have the Syriac version, and of course we have the Latin versions, of which the Latin Vulgate is the most significant. and we also have versions of Genesis and the Pentateuch in Coptic, Ethiopian, Armenian and Arabic. Okay, so we have this diverse body of textual witnesses, and of those probably really the most significant are the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they give us a controlled sample of what these documents look like 1,000 years earlier than our complete Old Testament manuscript. Because the unasked question is, how come we have 10,000 copies of the Greek New Testament, how come we have 5 or 6 copies of the Hebrew Bible? And the answer is basically the Christians destroyed them as part of our persecution of Jews. The secondary answer is that there weren't as many Jewish communities, therefore they weren't generating and using as many copies of the biblical documents. But the primary thing is that we had a systematic policy of destroying Jewish religious texts. Part of our dark history as Christians. Yeah.
The finds at Qumran, are they a mixture of Hebrew and Greek and other languages? Or Hebrew?
Mostly Hebrew, some Aramaic. I don't think there are any Greek texts from Qumran.
So the Gospels in Aramaic, the ones...
There are no Gospels from Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish writings.
Gnostic Gospels?
No, that's Nag Hammadi. That's right, yeah. And Nag Hammadi is also found in 1948, but in Egypt, and they represent a treasure trove from about the 4th, 5th century CE. Yeah. No, these things are very easily blended together. That's fine. Yep. So I thought there was another question. Okay. So in terms of the textual evidence for Genesis, we do not have a complete copy of Genesis in Hebrew earlier than 1000 AD. But we do have enough other bits and pieces from Qumran, as well as the evidence for the ancient Greek translations, that give us a bit of a control on, we can sort of see and reconstruct, in a sense, how this text has developed. In terms of form criticism, one of the things we recognise is that we're looking at Genesis, we've got a very different genre than what we're going to find, say, in Leviticus. Leviticus will be detailed regulations of how to run a temple. Okay, we get nothing like that in Genesis. So Genesis is more family legends, tribal legends about the ancestors and some of the places which were significant to the ancestors, like Hebron, the Jacob's well at Sychar, or Shechem, and so on. So we recognise that in the Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 12 to 50, we've got a different set of genre than we're going to find in some other parts of the Pentateuch. And that implies, of course, different context for that information being shaped, preserved, transmitted. The sort of genealogies and so on, they'll have a particular function within the social dynamics of an ancient community, ancient tribal people. It raises questions about transmission and reception and how did this material survive and so on. And they're the kind of things you would look at if you were doing the Pentateuch subject. Okay? We don't go into them in depth in an introductory course. But again, one of the issues here is recognising it's not appropriate to ask hard 21st century historical questions of ancient traditional materials. They weren't gathered and shaped and formed and preserved to answer the kinds of questions we're wanting to ask of them. Doesn't mean we can't ask them, but we have to nuance our expectations and not expect modern historical certainty out of ancient family stories and all the rest. Okay. Source criticism, and we will spend a little bit more time on this one. It's quite clear that the Pentateuch as a whole, and even Genesis, is a composite text. And a lot of research, particularly through the late 18th, 19th, early 20th century, a lot of research focused on the sources behind the Pentateuch. Now, the original motivation for doing that was to protect and defend the authorship of the Pentateuch by Moses. Okay, and what they were trying to say was, well, yes, okay, we understand Moses wasn't there having a chat with Abraham. We get that. We know Moses wasn't there on the 3rd day of creation. Okay, in Genesis chapter 1. So where did he get that information from? Well, the critical answer to hold off the secular humanistic critics was to say, but Moses had access to ancient sources, and he wove the sources together to create the Pentateuch. All right? So although Pentateuchal criticism has subsequently become much more radical, and it is not mosaic in any sense other than a mosaic of little bits and pieces, okay? The original impetus for source critical studies of the Pentateuch was actually to defend the traditional idea that Moses was the author but had used earlier material. Now, of course, that all has to be predicated on what kind of alphabet, what kind of writing system, what kind of archival systems would have been there in a society such as the tribes of Israel prior to the slavery in Egypt. I mean, yeah, it's once you start teasing it out, the whole idea of Moses writing the Pentateuch collapses. So the classical model, which you'll hear about, which is now entirely out of date, is JEDP. Okay, the Yahwistic, the Elohistic, the Deuteronomistic, and the priestly explanation, and we'll come to that in a second. These days it's much more nuanced, but the JEDP hypothesis has been, at one stage it was commonly described as the most assured result of critical scholarship. That's like, welcome aboard the Titanic, the unsinkable ship. You know? Don't say things like that, because in 50 years' time there'll be another theory that looks at it differently. But JEDP, the four-source hypothesis, has been one of the critical stages of the intellectual history of critical biblical scholarship. And it drove conservatives spare with rage and frustration and anxiety. And liberal scholars, critical scholars, have now moved on. Other people are still fighting in the trenches about JEDP. Serious critical scholars don't engage with JEDP anymore. But nor do we say Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Conversation has moved on. So, just in brief, so you have a sense of what's going on here. The idea was that the Yahwistic source, the critical feature was that this material used the divine name Yahweh right from the very beginning. Okay? So even in the story of Cain and Abel, and Adam and Eve and so on, it's Yahweh is being used. Whereas some of the other traditions only have Yahweh being used after the name is revealed at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. Okay? They tended to be interested in sites, locations from the south. So the traditions in J have a postcode from southern Israel. They're also more interested in Isaac and Abraham, who live in locations in the south. Hebron, for instance, a city in the south of Israel. They're not so interested in Jacob or Joseph, who come from the West Bank in the north. The view of God in the Yahwistic source is quite anthropomorphic. God pops by for a cup of tea, has a chat. You know, he's not a faraway, distant theological concept. It's a friendly old neighbour, really. The holy mountain in the J tradition is called Sinai. You may say, well, of course it is, because that's the name of the mountain. But in the other traditions, it has other names, which we tend not to notice. In the J tradition, Moses' father-in-law is Reuel, but in some of the other traditions, he's called Jethro. Presumably his father-in-law had one name, but there are differences. And in J, the indigenous people of Palestine are called Canaanites. And it's a storytelling, narrative style tends to dominate in J. Okay? And it was typically given a southern provenance during the time of basically Solomon. The theory was, in the golden age of Solomon, literature and high arts flourished, like the German High Court under Bismarck, and this is the time when the Yahwist constructed the great epic history of the Jewish kingdom, of the kingdom of David. Now, as you're probably picking up from my tone of voice, that's not where scholarship is anymore. Elohistic source is the distinctive thing is that up until Exodus 3 it calls God Elohim, and then after that it starts to call God Yahweh. So E is from Elohim, of course. It's much interested in the geography and the holy places in the north of Israel, or the centre of Israel, and therefore it's more interested in stories about Jacob and Joseph. Now some of these are just phenomena The question is, do the phenomena lead to a particular explanation? Okay, like JEDP. It has a more transcendent view of God. God doesn't drop by for a cup of tea. He sends an angel with a message. So God is a bit more distant. God speaks through dreams and angels and so on. Joseph, the dreamer. Okay. Whereas with Abraham, God actually comes down, remember, and Abraham is circumcised, and they chop up some animals, and the flaming torch goes backwards and forwards between the two parts of the animal's carcass and so on. That would never happen in E. You'd have a dream about it, but you wouldn't have it happening on the ground. The holy mountain in the E source is called Horeb, not Sinai. Moses' father-in-law is called Jethro. The indigenous people of Palestine are called Amorites. These people have a different vocabulary set. Okay? These stories have a different vocabulary set. And there's a very marked distinction in the E tradition between the religion of the patriarchs and the religion of Sinai. So there are some theological differences there as well. And it was, surprise, surprise, it was allocated a northern provenance somewhere between 850 and 750 when the northern kingdom was going through its golden age, according to the Old Testament narrative. The Deuteronomistic source, the distinctive feature of this source is not the word for God, but phrases like, with all your heart, with all your mind, the place which Yahweh has chosen to make his name dwell there, or I led them out of Egypt with a powerful hand and outstretched arm. These sort of phrases are used over and over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy and in other passages in the Old Testament which appear to have been edited by the Deuteronomist. Okay, particularly in speeches given by key characters at various moments in the story. The big theological idea for the Deuteronomist is that the only place you can worship God is in the one place he has chosen, which of course is Jerusalem. It's not Samaria, it's not Bethel, it's nowhere else. You've got to come to Jerusalem. That'd be like the Archbishop deciding to close all the parishes. If you want communion, come to the cathedral. Okay?
What do you just think about that, the way that's written, that people who wrote that had far better command of the language, to be more expressive all the time?
Not so much a better command, it's more flowery.
More flowery, but still you need to know your language more than...
I don't think so. I mean, anybody that can read and write has good training for an ancient culture, but this is a more hortator, this is a more like sermonic, exhorting people to do the right thing. It's more in a preaching mode rather than a teaching mode. So the genre is about instruction and moral exhortation. So they're loading up front, look at all the stuff God has done for us, therefore we have to love him with all our heart and soul and so on. And so it's not more sophisticated language, but it's a more flowery and evocative language. Yeah. But there is a difference in the language. Now, so we can recognize phenomena, the question then becomes the explanation. What's the explanation of this that accounts for this phenomena?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite a different way of writing.
Oh, and you pick it up. Once you're alerted to it, it's like, well, duh, how come I never saw that before? You know? It's that kind of thing. There's an emphasis on the covenant and being loyal to the covenant, and totally exterminating the indigenous people because they're not loyal to the covenant. So in my book a couple of years ago, I referred to them as the Yahwistic Taliban. Okay, destroying the statues of Buddha in Afghanistan and stopping girls from going to school and da 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 da. Well, that's the Deuteronomist. Only one place you can worship, and we'll control it, and you won't have any other set of rules.
Really nice words.
Yeah, yeah. They also call the holy mountain Horeb, not Sinai. They also call the indigenous people of Palestine Amorites. Now, part of what's going on here then, of course, is any adequate explanation is going to have to work with the fact that the so-called northern traditions, E, have a lot in common with the Deuteronomistic traditions. And in fact, the ultimate explanation is that the Deuteronomistic traditions actually come from the north and have a lot more in common with E than with J or P. There's an emphasis on the homily or the sermon as the primary genre of the Deuteronomist. and it's very much about rewards and punishment. So these are religious heavyweights who don't really have a life. Okay. There are some humanitarian touches. The rules for treating slaves and so on are a little bit more humane, and that could reflect, developing stages of the tradition. And the exhortations, by the way, are in the second person singular form, which we'll miss in English translation, but they're addressed to you as an individual, not to you as the gathering of the people of Israel. So there's a more homiletical, or that's not exactly evangelistic, but there's a more kind of preaching for repentance kind of tweak to the Deuteronomic tradition. Okay? And its provenance, while coming from the north, its provenance is Jerusalem, somewhere between 650, 625, and particularly identified with the discovery, inverted commas, of the scroll of the book of the law of Yahweh in the temple in around about 625, which may have been a prearranged discovery, of course. Look what we found. This is the new constitution. Found it in the back room. Then there's the priestly source, which has a relatively stable vocabulary set. Again, that's not surprising because the characteristic interests of the P source are more liturgical and ritual. Okay, so there's more limited, more stable vocab set. Very solemn style. Sogan refers to it as tending towards pomposity. It's very much focused on elements and traditions related to the cult, to the temple, and to the priesthood. Has a fascination with genealogies because that's really important to work out who's a priest and who's not a priest. Very interested in chronologies. Again, that's really important from a priestly point of view. Got to get the dates right. Make sure the times are right. Has a very distant view of God and a high valuation of the Aaronic priesthood, the sons of Aaron within the house of Levi. So it's not just the Levitical priests, it's the Aaronite priests, are the ones with the future. And it's often identified as being the final form of the Pentateuch created in Jerusalem during the Persian period, although of course incorporating much older materials. Hence JEDP reflects the chronological sequence of those four sources. Now up until the middle 1970s, that was just the bread and butter view of how the Pentateuch was written. Take no prisoners, ask no questions. But of course nobody stops there. Lots of PhDs have been done on it in the meantime. So you get something like this attractive diagram. Okay? Now that's an attempt to try and capture in a visual graphic the kind of different traditional JEDP elements within the existing Pentateuch. And what that's saying is that Genesis through to Exodus 15 is a bit of a mix of JEP, and basically from the middle of Exodus to the end of Numbers it's almost entirely P, and Deuteronomy is basically D and nothing else. Now again, one level that's just phenomenological. Okay, those characteristics are true of that literature. The question is, how do we explain it? What is the explanation for this mosaic dimension of the Pentateuch? Okay, so it sort of hurts your eyes a bit, especially on a nice bright screen. Okay, so then moving across to looking at the historical social science dimension, particularly paying attention to Genesis. And we won't revisit the stuff from 3 weeks ago, but just to remind ourselves that one of the ways of understanding history is that it operates on 3 levels, rather like the 3 dials on an old-fashioned water meter or power meter. There's one that's moving around pretty quickly. That's the everyday stuff. What did you have for breakfast today? What train did you catch? Who did you get that SMS from? That sort of stuff. Didn't happen in the ancient world. The middle level of history is a clock that's moving more slowly, a dial that's moving more slowly. And it's like, what language are we speaking? Who's the empire in charge of the world at the moment? What technologies do we have access to? And that stays in place for several hundred years at a time. And when you're living in that time period, that's how it's always been. Okay? And then there's another dial that's moving much more slowly, and that's the sort of geological timelines. And that's to do with climate change and other things, so that, in the big, some things that basically are changing so slowly, like human nature, the sexual drive, the capacity of humans to organise ourselves into structured societies and create languages and rituals and so on, that don't change much over thousands of years, indeed tens of thousands of years. Okay? So in the case of Genesis, where we have stories which purport to be stories on the fast style, telling us about the family of Abraham and Jacob and whether Joseph was getting on with his brothers and what they really thought of him and so on. But really, we're dealing really with stories that are more reflecting that middle dynamic of the cultural patterns that stay in place for hundreds of years. And we have an increasing knowledge of that middle period of history, that middle layer of history. I mean, we also know where Africa is and where Turkey is and so on. That's a given. But we're getting more and more information about the technology, the culture, the language, the politics, the social structures of ancient societies, the trade routes, cultural connections, etc. Okay. So, for example, we know that everything else being equal, the northern extremity of Egyptian control was basically the Sea of Galilee. Or if you like, go another couple of metres, a couple of kilometres, the Lebanese mountains. It was very difficult for Egypt to ever extend and maintain effective control beyond the Golan Heights and beyond Mount Hermon. Okay? There's a natural barrier, and it was a long way from home, and the technologies didn't allow transport of resources and so on. But there were major Egyptian centres around the Sea of Galilee, including what we now call Bet Shean, which in the second millennium was a major Egyptian city. So we find Egyptian materials occasionally at Bethsaida, which is 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, because that was about the northeastern corner of the Egyptian Empire. Okay? Occasionally the people in Mesopotamia or in Turkey would become sufficiently powerful that they would extend their control beyond the Lebanese mountains down to the borders of Egypt. And very occasionally they'd even conquer Egypt for 50 or 100 years and then they'd retreat. That's the big sweep of history in this part of the world. Now, part of that dynamic means that anybody who lived in ancient Palestine knew what it meant to be a slave of Egypt. You didn't actually have to be located in Egypt to be liberated from Egyptian slavery. Okay? So it just reframes the story of the Exodus from a historical perspective. Okay? It's like anybody living in, say, the Caribbean knows what it is to be under the control of the American economy and culture. And what many people in East Asia are discovering, that after a century or so of being on the back foot, Chinese cultural influence is actually the only game in town. And it's going to be that way for who knows how much, way beyond the time any of us are going to be around. China is going to be the dominant influence in that part of the world, as it always has been, with occasional periods of introspection and retreat. Okay? So this is what I mean by that middle layer of history. There are some things that are just, constants for hundreds of years at a time, and behind them are some underlying constants, which are just the basic structure of the stage on which human history is mapped out. So occasionally we'll get information, we will have information about particular events or even a particular person, or more likely a particular place. What's the difference there? Well, a place is a physical reality that is you can dig up or you can discover it. And if you can identify it correctly, fine. Jericho is the oldest inhabited city in the world. It goes back to 10,000 BC. Okay, we know where Jericho was. We can dig it up. It doesn't mean we can tell you the names of the kings of Jericho. That's another level of detail, let alone what life was like in Jericho for a particular family, or give you the address for Rahab's bordello. Okay, although the Israelite spies obviously knew the address for Rahab's bordello. places are more susceptible to our kind of historical tools. Events are trickier, but we can sometimes get a reference to them in other literature, whether it's inscriptions or whatever. People, even trickier. For an individual named in the Bible to appear in another non-biblical text is even more rare, less likely to occur. And so we shouldn't expect it, because it would be remarkable if Joseph's name turned up in Egyptian text. And then we'd say, was it the same Joseph? Who was his father? How many brothers did he have? You know, yada, yada, yada. Okay? So this gets us into the minimalist, maximalist debates that I mentioned earlier. People who put a high value on taking the Bible literally, face value, da-da-da-da-da, tend towards a maximalist position until they're persuaded and dragged, kicking and screaming, to another position. People that are suspicious of the historicity of the Bible because of the historical literary dimensions we're dealing with tend to say, well, yes, the Bible is a very important historical artifact, but the information in there may be, the most important historical information is that the Bible itself exists. As for the historicity of a particular event, we have to take the event and then see what else we can find in order to validate that event. Okay? As a matter of method, I tend towards a minimalist position, so that I'm not constantly surrendering ground to the secular humanists, but I'm saying, okay, you worry about all that stuff. I'm going to assume the sort of minimalist set of historicity and then see where I go from there in terms of building a theology. And that's a methodological choice that I've made. You're welcome, of course, to make others. Okay, so that's the kind of well behind the book of Genesis, and indeed Exodus and so on. Word within the text. Now we're going to be focusing more on some of the literary characteristic of the text as it now exists in the Bible. We're not going to be so concerned on theories about how it got to be written in the first place. So at a big level, at a macro level, Genesis can be described as a book of stories, and it shouldn't say Genesis 1, that's a leftover. I did have Genesis 1 to Exodus 15, and I didn't edit that sufficiently the other day. So Genesis, for reasons I'll say in a moment, can be seen as the book of stories. Yeah, the stories about where we came from. Because by the end of Genesis, all the descendants of Jacob are living in Egypt. And they're doing just fine. But they're now on site, ready for the next story. And Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers is one way of seeing them hanging together. Is this is the story of the tribe, or this is the books about the tribes of Yahweh. Okay, as you can see, as a normal discipline, I do not write Yahweh out in full. I just put the 4 consonants because that's the Jewish tradition. But I don't have any qualms about pronouncing the word, and some people would. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers is, as we'll see in a moment, has a kind of literary coherence. And basically it's the tribes of Yahweh gathered around the mountain of God. That's the basic literary structure of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And the book of Deuteronomy, and the word Deuteronomy means second law, or the law repeated. Okay? And so it's the renewing of the covenant, and it's Moses' sermon before he dies, calling the people to faithfulness. That's the literary design of Deuteronomy. Okay? So if we look at Genesis, the book of stories, we have a series of stories. 7 days of creation, the story of the heavens of the earth, the story of Noah, the story of Babel, the story of Abraham, the son of Terah, the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and the story of the sons of Jacob, which turns out to be basically the story of Joseph, because he's the key character in that story. Right, so it's a cascading series of stories. That's the literary genre that we're dealing with here. And the hint or the clue for it is this word toledot, which occurs 13 times in the book of Genesis, and it's often translated as with the word generations. These are the generations of. Okay, but actually there's 13 times. There are 2 ways in which it occurs. 1, 2, 3, 5 times it occurs without a genealogy, and it serves as the introduction to a story. And another 8 times, another number of times, it occurs with a genealogy, and when that's happening, it actually is the end of a story. Yep.
I'm not following.
Right?
What does toledot mean?
So I just said generations. That's the Hebrew word for generation. So this particular term occurs 13 or so times in the book of Genesis, and occurs in 2 uses, with a genealogy or without a genealogy attached to it. Okay, and when it's with the genealogy, it tends to be at the end of a story, and it's the wrap-up of a story. When it occurs without a genealogy, as for instance in Genesis 2, verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, there's no genealogy, but it's the beginning of a story, which is the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 3 and 4, 2 and 3. So it can mark. It's a literary marker, is what's being suggested, coming out of the Hebrew narrative use to mark the beginning and end of a collection of stories. Okay. Now, again, this is way too much detail for an introductory course, but I want to let you see that I'm not totally making this up out of thin air just to fill in the morning, and that there is a kind of some scholarship and detailed work underneath this kind of stuff. So, here I'm particularly drawing on the work of Thomas Thompson, whose Irish parents were singularly lacking in creativity when they named him. Thomas, the son of Thomas Thompson. One of the really significant creative Old Testament scholars of the last 30 or 40 years, now retired. And he's identified, as others have as well, but Thompson has particularly drawn on this toledot structure as a clue. So using the occurrences of the toledot phenomena, we get Genesis 1 to chapter 2 verse 3, which is the 7 days of creation. Okay, that's like a sort of prologue. But then we get the story of the heavens and the earth, chapter 2 verse 4, these are the generations, ends with the genealogy of Noah and the toledot with the genealogy of the earth. Then we get the story of Noah, the story of Babel, the story of Abraham, the story of Isaac, the story of Joseph basically, but the sons of Jacob. And each of those chunks reflects that structure. Begins with these are the generations of, but no genealogy, whole lot of story, then you get the genealogy at the end, okay, along with the toledot word in Hebrew, of course. So this is a way of seeing a literary structure and the way somebody has hung the stuff together. How have they arranged it? And they've used the metaphor of a series of stories, cascading stories. So if that's the case, then one useful way to read Genesis is to read it by paying attention to those sections and to recognize that each of those stories may have its own message, point, whatever that it's trying to get across. Okay? Again, you do more work on that if you're doing the Pentateuch subject. Now, a couple of things to note out of this. One would be that point about the toledot pattern. One particular story to note would, of course, be the Genesis 1 story, the 7 days of creation, which has its own internal structure. If you very, very quickly, days 1, 2, 3 correspond to days 4, 5, 6. If you look at what's going on in days 1, 2, 3, days 4, 5, 6 represent a further development of the parallel day, and the previous parallel is a necessary precursor to what's being stated in days 4, 5, and 6. This is not random information. It's not just a historical pattern. This is somebody who's structuring a beautiful poetic structure. And on the 7th day, God says, well done, lad. Time for a rest. Okay? So nothing happens on Shabbat. The flood story, again, a really fascinating story. And it has deep theological meaning. I mean, in one sense, all of us are on this side of the flood. And that resonates with people in Brisbane and Ipswich and so on, okay? Life is different pre-January 2011 from since January 2011. Life was different pre-74 to after 74. So we all live on this side of a major event which has changed everything and destroyed the past. Okay, now that, I suggest, is the truth in the Noah story. We're all survivors, because everybody who lived before us is dead and gone, and we're the survivors that are still here. Okay? That's a deep human truth. So what is the covenant? What is God expecting of us as survivors? We are the survivors of the last 10 million years of human story. Okay? The Joseph saga, Genesis 37 to 49, are one of the most developed and nuanced stories in the Old Testament. And unlike Ruth, it doesn't exist as a separate book, so people don't recognize it. But it's a really interesting novella, Genesis 37 to 49, the story of Joseph. And then Exodus 1 to 15, which we flicked up very briefly much earlier this morning. I'm going to bring it up again. You can see a really definite structure. The whole of Exodus 1 to 15 makes sense in literary terms once we see the kind of underlying structure. So let me just bring that up for a second. Did I have it up before? Do it this way. So, bump it up there and then make it bigger. Okay. So, if we're looking at the Exodus 1 to 15, one way of seeing it is as the story of the saving of the children of Jacob. So the sons of Jacob, the children of Jacob, have all ended up in Egypt at the end of Genesis. And now we're going to have the great story of them being rescued by Yahweh. Okay? Which includes the Passover and includes the crossing of the Red Sea and all that stuff. Okay? So what are we dealing with? So, and this again is drawing directly on the work by Thomas Thompson, and he developed this. He proposed a genre which he called a traditional chain complex narrative. So a way of telling a story using traditional materials which have been around for yonks, which the storyteller joins like links in a chain. Okay? And in his reconstruction of the genre, you begin with a set of triplets that set up the scene. They introduce the key characters, they explain what the problem is, and they hint at the final resolution. Okay, so in this case, the stage is set in Exodus 1 to 7. You can download this off the Moodle site, remember. Jacob's descendants are in Egypt, but there's a new king who does not remember Joseph. Okay? And so, verses 8 to 14, we get the oppression of the king of Egypt by the king of Egypt as he pushes the Hebrew slaves to work for him. And then we get this terrible story of the killing of the male children. Okay, and of course it's the two Hebrew midwives who stand up to the king and don't collaborate in the murder of the young male babies. But that third preliminary episode actually alludes to the fact that the resolution of this story is going to be the slaying of the firstborn. I mean, that's Thompson's literary analysis of this story. Then we have a whole series of material. The hero survives the threat, the hero is commissioned, the hero is reassured, the hero returns, the hero confronts the villain. And then look at what's happening in chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. We get three sets of triplets. Okay? The first set of mighty signs. Go to Pharaoh in the morning, and it's turning water into blood. Go to Pharaoh and tell him, it's the frogs. Go stretch out your staff, and it's the gnats. Second set of signs. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. Go to Pharaoh and tell him, throw handfuls of dust. Third set of signs. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. Go to Pharaoh and tell him, stretch out your hand. This is clearly deliberate, intentional literary design at work. Okay? This is not someone taking notes as the events unfold. This is not your Al Jazeera correspondent in Cairo broadcasting the events of the day. This is somebody creating a beautifully structured, nuanced story with three sets of three. And then there's the climactic scene the Passover of Yahweh, of which the essential critical act, and we should be critical of this story on humanitarian and moral grounds, is the killing of all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians, while the firstborn sons of the Hebrews are spared. Okay, you are trying to kill our baby boys, our God's bigger than your God, and we're going to take out all of your baby, all your firstborn sons. Now, of course, as a firstborn son who's not Jewish, I have a problem with this, just as I do with the slaying of the horses. Okay, this is not a nice story. This is not a story that we can proudly trot out there and say, look at what a fantastic thing it is to be a person of faith. Okay? And if I were an Egyptian Christian, how would I read this story? Okay? But then I'm moving into the world of the reader, not the world of the text. So it's not fair to bring those moral theological questions. First of all, we've got to read the story as it is and really understand the dynamics that are going on. Finally, we get then to Yahweh's victory at the sea, and the conclusion is the Song of Miriam, which is Exodus chapter 15, just verses 20-21. Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider he has cast into the sea. Okay? So, whether Thompson is right or wrong, whether we nuance it in this way or that way, there's one way of reading Exodus 1-15 which recognises and respects the internal literary structure of the text. Okay? And it's not about how many people lived in Egypt, how big were the horses, how deep was the blood in the street. It's about a literary story, taking the story, the text, seriously. Okay, coming back to this then. So, we won't have time to go into this, but there are, when we're exploring the world of a biblical text, whether it's a passage or a book as a whole, these are some very simple, they're not copyrighted, they're just really, really simple, obvious, but often overlooked questions. What's going on here? What's happening? Who are the characters in this story? When is this story set? Where is the location of the story? And what is it about? What's the significance of telling this story? Okay? And you could ask that of Exodus 1-15. You could ask it just of the burning bush story in Exodus 3. Okay? They're just a way of asking some open-ended questions that have the effect of taking us into a deeper engagement with the text. Okay? Very simple questions, but they open up. Because they're not preset questions with predetermined answers. They're open-ended questions. And as Christian people doing that, of course, we're part of our theology of using Scripture is that as we're doing that, as we're reading the Bible and asking those sort of open-ended questions, we're actually in a conversation with God. There's something more than reading the Bible going on here. We're actually, like reading the Bible in that way is like tuning the radio to God's frequency. And the point of the exercise is not so much to become knowledgeable about the content of the Bible, but to put ourselves into a place, into a space where we're tuned into God's broadcast. And God's broadcast might be saying, actually, no, it's not okay. That's not what I intended at all. I never did that. I didn't kill all the Egyptian baby boys, or boys of any age. It happened to be the firstborn son. I'm being verbaled. Okay, and I don't want you going around treating people that way. Okay? Or God might be saying, that's what they did to my son. The story goes in a different way.
Wasn't at the time also the social climate of the day? I mean, there wasn't.
Does that make it okay?
No, I'm not saying it's okay, but.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the point. I mean, yeah, no, that's not. I mean, no. I mean, that's the. We don't read the Bible simply to discover how it was in the past so that we can reenact the past in the present. Now, a lot of people don't get that. They think we read the Bible to see how we should treat each other. Well, yes, to some extent, but not necessarily by copying the way they did it in the past. Okay? Like, if someone is in debt to me, I can no longer take them to the door frame and put a screwdriver through their ear and make them my slave. But the Old Testament says I can. Well, no, you can't. We have a different set of values. So the Bible is an invitation to a conversation with the God tradition. It is not a set of answers just to be picked up and applied to everyday life now. So it's a bit more nuanced than that. So yeah, we can understand that the world was a savage place back then, but frankly, the world is a savage place right now. Well, it's not even probably it is. I mean, look at East Africa. Look at any place. Yeah, Syria. You name it. Australian history and so on. So, yeah. So as I read the Bible, it's not about saying I'm looking up how to do it. I'm reading for spiritual wisdom. And the spiritual wisdom might be, do not take the children of your enemies and dash their heads against the stone, but look for a more Christ-like way. And that's not about demoting the Old Testament relative to the New Testament. It's just saying the spiritual wisdom of the Bible the spiritual wisdom of our faith is bigger than what we find in the Bible. Yeah.
I find in reading the Old Testament that that as you move through it, you get a sense of an evolving, maybe like an evolving morality and an evolving understanding of the people's relationship to God. You know, like they're changing how they see God from a rescuing, avenging God to to a different sort of God, and you get a sense of it, leading into a New Testament Christ story.
Yeah, that's one way of reading the Old Testament through a Christian lens as well. A Jewish reader would not agree with the last part of your sentence and would see no need to go there. And it also depends how we align the text in the Old Testament as to whether it's a continuous evolutionary improvement or whether it's a forward, back kind of stop-start reality. What you've been describing is a theory called progressive revelation, which was very popular in the end of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, which was that through the passage of the scriptures we see God progressively revealing more of himself, people understanding it in a way which is less tribal and more moralistic or more moral as we go from Joshua to the prophets. But it ain't that simple. I mean, the Jewish realities in the Second Temple period, it's not the case that they were overwhelmingly people with a moral view of the good life, wanting to turn the other cheek and so on. They had aspirations that God would intervene and punish the enemy, restore Jerusalem, and Jesus is presented in talking in that genre as well. The moon will turn to blood, the stars will drop out of the sky, and God will enforce God's will on humanity. And that's apocalyptic. It's actually more a reflex of we no longer have the capacity to do it ourselves, so we're seconding the job to the big fella upstairs because we don't have the capacity to defeat the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Hellenistic empires, the Roman Empire. So it's as much an index of changing geopolitical capacity as it is changing moral philosophy. But one way of framing it from a Christian perspective is to talk about a tendency towards Christ. But then the book of Revelation, Christ is pretty violent. The Christian Bible ends on one of the most violent notes that you'll find in the whole of the Bible, with the book of Revelation, which of course we tend to stay away from in Anglican circles. So it is more complex than and it could, any explanation which validates the position I'm in makes me ask questions about has it been too self-serving. Now, because that means I'm never going to win. I mean, never going to be happy with how I'm reading the Bible. Maybe that's okay, but there is a risk in self-validate, in explanations which validate the position I prefer, even though of course I'm right. Because if I thought I was wrong, I'd change. I mean, this is the sort of, I guess, the epistemological difficulty of trying to think out loud about this stuff. Okay, let's push on a bit more briefly, in a sense, I hope, to talk about looking at the world beyond the text. So here we're focusing more on Genesis in our world. Okay, how do we read the book of Genesis now? Okay, so some of the issues which will shape the way and this is a fairly short section, thankfully, some of the issues that shape the way we read the book of Genesis now are things like the interface, I haven't said clash, but the interface of truth, science and religion. In other words, explanations of where we came from. Okay? Because Genesis, particularly 1 to 11, offers a story of origins. Modern science offers a very different story of origins. And we live in a world predicated on the scientific explanation. And we wouldn't get in an aeroplane and trust ourselves to the pilot unless we really did believe in physics and the scientific explanation of the world. Okay? Even if occasionally it can go wrong, which is part of the explanation, actually. So issues around where we find ourselves in that conversation, and whether, for instance, whether the school we're teaching in is a school which is committed to creationism. Now that, of course, will not apply to any Anglican schools, but it may apply to many of the parents who send their kids to our Anglican school. Okay? So those sort of issues are not just past debates from a previous generation. Issues of gender and identity will come into the way we read Genesis, and particularly how we read Genesis 2 and 3, which is the Adam and Eve story. Okay? Questions of power and opportunity, which are in some ways the issues of empire and post-colonialism. Who has the power? Why do we find it so galling that Russia is reasserting its historical control over Crimea? We don't have any trouble with Anglo-Saxon people doing that, but we don't like the Russians doing it. What's going on here? It's okay for the Jews to go back and take over somewhere they haven't lived for 2,000 years, but Russia can't take over Crimea. Now, I'm not arguing for the Crimean intervention, I'm just saying what's going on there in terms of who's allowed to have power. Okay, and they preferably should be people that look like us, right? Because if they're Asians, we get a bit nervous. But they should be quite relaxed if we're in charge of the world. There's something wrong here. It's a little bit too self-serving. Climate change, eco-theology, issues like that will affect the way we read these stories. So, are humans by creation put by God in charge of the earth to subdue it and exploit it, or are we placed in the garden to nurture it? Okay, as servants of the garden. Okay, and again, do we read Genesis from the earth's perspective, or do we read Genesis from Adam's perspective, or from my perspective? And then what about the beliefs and the values we already come with before we even open the book? What values, beliefs, assumptions are we bringing into the process so that it will be very difficult for us not to read the Bible, not to read Genesis in a way that reinforces our existing beliefs and values and practices? Okay, I said that was a bit shorter, and indeed it was. I'll just get rid of that for a second.